Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about pass-fail grading. So this is an alternative grading system to the much more common, at least in the US, system of letter grades for courses. And there are some people who have argued that classes, especially in university, should be graded pass-fail. Sometimes across the board, sometimes certain courses, like general education courses and things like this. And I tend to agree with the latter perspective. I think that general education courses in universities could be graded pass-fail rather than letter grades. And there's a couple of major reasons I think this. One is that it's beneficial for students in GPA terms. Now, to a certain extent, I have always kind of said that as an instructor, I don't care about grades. Grades are not what is important to me, and that is true in the sense that what is important to me primarily as an instructor is that students learn the material, that they understand the concepts, that they can apply the rhetorical or analytical techniques, the critical reading, whatever it is that we are working on in that class, to the materials they would need to apply it to, right? I want them to get out of the course the knowledge and understanding that they are meant to get out of it. I don't necessarily care about letter grades. That being said, students care about letter grades. Students care a lot about letter grades. Anybody who's ever taught will be aware of this. There is a term called grade grubbing, which is when students attempt to wheedle out of an instructor a better grade than what they have earned in the course. And the reason I bring that up is not to condemn that practice. On the one hand, students have a vested interest in getting the best possible grades they can, and so they have every reason to try and convince instructors to give them better grades. Fair play. At the same time, what it indicates is more of a focus on the grade than on the material, than on learning, knowledge, etc., etc. And again, students have a vested interest. They need the best GPA that they can, sometimes to get into programs like here at Penn State, you need a certain GPA to get into the medical school, to get into the business program, et cetera, right? Sometimes it's to get into graduate school. Sometimes it's to keep a scholarship, whatever it is, right? Grades have an impact on students. And so from a student's perspective, where grades are very important, the difference between a B and an A in a course may matter on a GPA level. And that may have consequences beyond that, right? And I have had students at the end of semesters say to me, I need to get at least a B in this class. If I don't, then I will lose my scholarship and I will not be able to afford to stay in university. And I have to say, I'm sorry, you didn't earn that grade. You earned a C, and I have to give you the grade that you've earned. And that sucks for those students. And I really genuinely do feel for them, but there isn't anything I can do about that, right? So grades do have a real serious actual impact on students. And one of the consequences of that, in my view, is that students will often approach the education process as the process of getting the best grade possible, rather than getting the best command of the knowledge possible. And those are not necessarily the same thing, right? If you are thinking about a class in terms of, I want to get the best grade possible, most likely what you are thinking about is how do I give this instructor what they want? And this is a game that all students play. Sometimes it's more overt, sometimes it's less overt, right? So when a student comes into office hours or in class asks me, what are you looking for in this assignment? That is a framing, whether or not they consciously intend it to be this way. That is a framing that says, I assume that you as the instructor want something specific, and I want to give you the thing that you want so that I get a better grade, right? There was an undergrad, in my undergrad university, there was a professor who, the advice among all of the older English majors who had courses with this guy was, in the essays for his class, you say about those texts exactly what he said during the lecture. You do not give your own reading of it. You do not make your own arguments. You do not analyze it in your own way. You repeat back to him the things that he said you should know about those texts. That was a very overt instance of the game is to figure out what this instructor wants. But when you have that pressure taken off, right? When it's no longer a question of, I need to give this instructor what they want as well as I can so that I get an A, then you're much freer, right? You have much more freedom, much more opportunity to build your own arguments, to explore new writing styles, to bring creativity or uniqueness to the project. Because if you try an experimental structure for an essay and it doesn't work that well, right? Maybe you get a C on that paper, whereas if you had written a more traditional essay, you could have gotten an A. But you've learned something by trying that experiment, right? You've learned something by trying that structure, by challenging what the essay as a form can do, by exploring its limitations and pushing its boundaries, right? And I would suggest... So I had another undergrad professor who at one point said this, and I think this is really quite a smart insight. He said, I can write a perfect 5-paragraph essay, which is why I never do it. Right? And I think that's such a central idea to what education should be all about. Right? And that's much easier in a pass-fail system. Right? Because if I can write a perfect 5-paragraph essay and I know that I can get an A on it every time I do it, in a letter grade system, I have an incentive to do that. All I have to do is reproduce a thing that I know that I can do, rather than challenging myself or trying something new, experimenting, doing something unique that I haven't done before. But I also compromise my own learning through that, right? If I just repeat the same thing over and over and over again, I'm not gaining new knowledge. I'm not exploring boundaries that I could otherwise be exploring. And I'm not doing that because I know that I want to get an A. Whereas if I'm in a pass-fail system, all I have to do is produce work that meets the standard for passing, right? I have to, and so this is a great thing, I think, for classes where you want students to try new things, learn new things, experiment with their own education, right? Because at that point, it takes off that pressure of, I have to get an A or my GPA will suffer. And I don't want to make, this is going to sound bad, but it's not meant to be, and I'll explain in just a second why it's not. If I can get the same GPA outcome by doing work that would be at a C level as by doing work that would be at an A level, then I don't need to make myself insane trying to get an A. And again, that sounds quite bad because it sounds like it's lowering standards, and it actually isn't in a number of ways. In a very direct way, it can be, and I don't want to downplay that. But what it allows instead is students to focus on gaining mastery of the material rather than gaining mastery of the grading. Right? Because this is one of the major problems widely recognized with the contemporary public education system in the United States, is that when teachers have to teach to the test, students do not gain an understanding of the material itself. What they gain an understanding of is how to take a specific test. And so the material, the knowledge, the information that they're supposed to be learning becomes secondary to that objective. And a pass-fail system can eliminate a lot of that pressure, right? You can focus more on gaining the knowledge because you know you don't have to be perfect in order to get the credit for the course. So that can be quite liberating. There's also a positive psychological effect on students for this, because one of the major pressures that university students face, especially at schools with a number of people who were very high performing in high school, like Penn State, where I teach, or places where there's a lot of pressure to maintain high GPAs, things like this, that pressure is diminished. And I know there are all sorts of arguments about like, oh, pressure makes diamonds and hard work will pay off. Yes, and that's true. But at the same time, we have a contemporary mental health crisis in the United States in general, but among university students in particular, right? High levels of pressure are not necessary, especially when that is continual high levels of pressure for years and years, is not necessarily psychologically healthy. And so having courses like Gen Ed courses, general education courses, be shifted to pass-fail, where students can spend more time learning the material or the underlying concepts, the methodologies of thinking about the world from humanistic or scientific or philosophical or artistic or whatever it is perspectives, and then decreasing the pressure of grades, especially in subjects that students are often not interested in, right? In classes that students would generally not prefer to take. I mean, I have taken to telling my students, because I teach mostly general education courses here at Penn State, I've taken to telling them at the beginning of the semester, I recognize that most of you would not choose to be in this class. I don't begrudge you that, right? There were classes that I, as an undergrad, would rather not have taken. My 8 credits of Bio 101 and 102 were the key ones that come to mind. I would have preferred not to have done them. And so I don't object to you not being thrilled with taking Gen Ed courses. However, the concepts are what is ultimately important. The ability to think about things from particular perspectives and the skill sets that you're going to develop. Again, the problem becomes if the primary driving factor for a student is, I want the best grade, then it is much, much harder to focus on, I want to develop this skill set and learn these concepts, gain this knowledge, etc., etc. Alongside this, you have a tremendous amount of pressure to be successful in a course where students are generally not that interested, right? Most students are not that interested in rhetoric and composition. It's simply not maybe a skill set that they have, not a thing they enjoy doing, not a thing that they see as relevant to their future academic careers, professional careers, although I would challenge that perspective, but that is a different story. And so they have to put in a lot of work, a lot of time, and those are good things. You should be putting in work, should be putting in time in university, but they also stress substantially. You combine that with the other pressures on university students, and it has resulted in massive increases in mental health issues and psychological distress among university students. And decreasing that pressure in a way that liberates students to think more critically and to engage more, I'm going to say productively, with course content rather than with grading, I think is incredibly beneficial for everyone involved.